Old Hollywood handed these stars everything: fame, fortune, and faces the whole world recognized. The one thing it never gave them was children. Some made the choice deliberately. Some had it taken from them by illness, loss, or lives too unstable to hold a family together. These are their real stories. Greta Garbo walked away from Hollywood in 1941 and never looked back. She spent her final decades in a private apartment in New York, rarely seen, almost never interviewed. She had several romantic relationships over the years but turned none of them into marriage or a family. She never explained why in any lasting detail. She simply lived alone, guarded her privacy with unusual ferocity, and died in 1990 without a husband or children. The woman the world spent decades watching on screen remained completely unknowable in private life. Katharine Hepburn had exactly one husband. She married Ludlow Ogden Smith in 1928, but only after he agreed to change how he was addressed so she would not spend her life as Mrs. Smith. The marriage lasted 6 years and ended in divorce in 1934. She never remarried. In later interviews, Hepburn was direct about the decision. She had chosen adventure over domesticity, and that meant living without the responsibilities of raising children. She said it plainly and without regret. She left no children behind. Carole Lombard came closer than most. After marrying Clark Gable in 1939, she threw herself into building a real life with him, not a Hollywood romance but an actual home. They bought a ranch in Encino, kept chickens, rode horses, and called each other Ma and Pa. She wanted children badly. Accounts from people close to her describe a woman who had everything except the one thing she most wanted. In January 1942, she traveled to Indiana for a war bond tour and raised nearly $2 million in a single day. She was 33, at the absolute peak of her career, and had just completed To Be or Not to Be. On the return flight to California, TWA Flight 3 went down near Las Vegas. Lombard, her mother, and everyone else on board died on impact. She never had children because she never got the time. Claudette Colbert Ava Gardner was the youngest of 7 children raised on a North Carolina farm. She said it was a happy childhood even when money was tight. Hollywood gave her 3 marriages: Mickey Rooney, Artie Shaw, and Frank Sinatra, and none of them produced children. She wanted a family. The accounts are consistent on that point. During her marriage to Sinatra, she became pregnant twice and terminated both pregnancies. Her autobiography points to MGM contract clauses that penalize stars for having babies, and other accounts connect those decisions just as strongly to the instability of her life with Sinatra. She divorced him in 1957, stayed close to him regardless, and died in 1990 without children. Claudette Colbert kept her first marriage a secret for years. She wed actor Norman Foster in 1928, but they lived in separate homes, and her mother, who reportedly despised Foster, refused to let him through her door. The marriage quietly ended in divorce in 1935. On Christmas Eve of that same year, she married Surgeon Joel Pressman in Yuma, Arizona. That second marriage was the steady center of her life until Pressman died in 1968. They had no children. After his death, Colbert said simply that he had been her best friend. She outlived him by decades, eventually settling in Barbados, and when she died in 1996, she left the bulk of her estate to her longtime companion Helen O'Hagan. Anna May Wong never married and never had children. When Tokyo reporters asked about marriage plans in 1936, she told them she was wedded to her art. By that point she had already spent years being passed over for the very roles she should have owned. Producers cast Europeans and Americans in Chinese parts rather than give them to her. In 1935, MGM shut her out of the good earth entirely and handed the lead to Louisa Reiner in Yellowface. Wong was offered only the villain. Anti-miscegenation rules in American cinema blocked her from most romantic leads and even from on-screen kisses unless an Asian co-star could be found. She kept working, in Europe, on Broadway, and back in Hollywood, but she died in 1961 without a husband or a family.
Jean Arthur married twice and kept Hollywood at arm's length for most of her life. Her first marriage, to photographer Julian Anker in 1928, was annulled after a single day. Her second, to producer Frank Ross Jr. in 1932, ended in divorce in 1949. She had no children by either marriage. People close to her described an intensely private woman who found fame uncomfortable and publicity almost unbearable. After Shane in 1953, she walked away from films and never came back. She taught drama at Vassar and at the North Carolina School of the Arts, then spent decades in a modest house in Carmel by the Sea. When she died in 1991 at 90, there was no funeral. Her ashes were scattered off Point Lobos.
Lillian Gish was performing professionally before she was old enough to attend school properly. She made her stage debut at 5 after her family fell into poverty and never stopped working. In 1912, Mary Pickford introduced her and her sister Dorothy to D.W. Griffith, and Gish became one of silent cinema's defining faces almost immediately. She never married. In a 1982 interview, she said work had always been the most important thing in her life and that she had no regrets. She kept acting well into old age, taking late roles in The Night of the Hunter and The Whales of August, and lived to 99. When she died in 1993, she left her estate to her friend Helen Hayes and set aside funds for the Museum of Modern Art to restore Griffith's films. She was buried beside her sister Dorothy. She left no children. Jean Arthur married twice and kept Hollywood at arm's length for most of her life. Her first marriage, to photographer Julian Anker in 1928, was annulled after a single day. Her second, to producer Frank Ross Jr. in 1932, ended in divorce in 1949. She had no children by either marriage. People close to her described an intensely private woman who found fame uncomfortable and publicity almost unbearable. After Shane in 1953, she walked away from films and never came back. She taught drama at Vassar and at the North Carolina School of the Arts, then spent decades in a modest house in Carmel by the Sea. When she died in 1991 at 90, there was no funeral. Her ashes were scattered off Point Lobos. Mae West married Frank Wallace in 1911 at 16 and kept it hidden from the public for over 30 years. The relationship effectively ended almost immediately. They did not live together and the divorce was not finalized until 1942. They had no children. West was already building something on her own terms: vaudeville, Broadway, her own material. By the late 20s, she was writing and starring in productions like Sex and Diamond Lil, one of which got her arrested on morality charges. In Hollywood, she helped launch Cary Grant in She Done Him Wrong, wrote much of her own dialogue, and became one of the highest-paid performers in the country by the mid-30s. She never remarried after the Wallace divorce and died in 1980 without children. Kay Francis accumulated 3 husbands and kept none of them. She married James Dwight Francis in 1922, Bill Gaston in 1925, and actor-director Kenneth McKenna in 1931, and held on to the surname from the first marriage through all of it. By the mid-30s, Warner Brothers had built her into their top female star: gowns, poise, society woman polish. McKenna spent most of his time in New York while her Hollywood career was peaking, and that marriage collapsed by 1934. She never settled into a stable private life and never became a mother. She died in 1968 and left the bulk of her estate to the seeing eye. Old Hollywood was very good at selling its stars as complete human beings, people with full lives, happy families, and futures that extended well beyond the camera. The reality was more complicated, more painful, and far more interesting than any studio ever admitted. These were real lives, shaped by illness, ambition, loss, timing, and choices that did not always belong to the people making them.